right. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and start with the rocks and crack generator of today's lecture. So I'm just going to be in Designer. So the point of this is to kind of introduce some nodes to you guys that you may not be aware of or may not be using. And I'm going to hide my library because I just like having the extra space. So do that, turn off the library. And I'll do a new substance. And we'll do just and actually, okay. So first things first that I like to start off, and let me go ahead and actually open up my templates. Let me go ahead and just open up my template instead. So I'm not having to deal with this. And let me make this a little bit bigger. There we go. There we go. All right. So one of the things that I like to do is like I said last time, I like to start with my height first and foremost. So I'd like to start off with a tile random. So whenever you guys are going to be making cobblestone or some sort of rock type material, so instead of just using a tile generator, I like to work with a tile random. For me, it just makes, I like the ease of having a little bit more control, and I feel like it gives me a bit more control with the tile random. But the first thing I do, you may just be tempted to just start with this or a tile generator. I don't like to work this way to start off. I like to create my own single rock first and then create a generator out of that. So I'll start with like a basic shape. Typically I use the brick shape because it's got, we go to brick here and do pattern specific, it gives me this nice little fall off, which helps quite a bit when it comes to height. So from there, I like to blend it in with a gradient. Now what a gradient will do is it kind of gives it a slope. So we'll just grab a gradient linear. And so again, we went over height maps a little bit last time. So this is kind of how I'm generating a height map with this single rock. And again, I don't like to cap it at 100% black and white, so I'll attach the levels to this. And I will just pull it so that I don't have 100% of either. And I may adjust this along the way, but what's really nice about the levels is, again, I can push that height just a little bit more. So let me grab a blend. And I'm going to hook this to the background. And then I'm going to hook up my single rock to the foreground, and I'm going to set my blend to multiply. This is a shape. And then the pattern that I chose was brick. Yes, if I go too fast, please slow me down. So after I hook these two up, what's really nice, like I said, is I don't like to go at 100% black because I don't necessarily want the rock to completely fall into the rock generator that I'm creating. You may want that. If you do, again, you'll just come over here to those levels and pull it back. So notice that it starts to kind of disappear into this shape. But for me, I kind of like to have the whole thing and then make adjustments from there. So this is the basis of the first rock that I do. So then I will come in here and I will grab a tile random. And I'll put this in the tile random. And by default, it doesn't change anything. So I have to go in and set the pattern to pattern input. So now I have, and let me just hook this up so you guys can kind of see it along the way. There we go. So now I have all of these rocks in here. The gradient is going the same direction. So again, that doesn't look very believable at this point in time. So what I really love, like I said, about the tile randoms is I get a more randomized tile look, whether it's a randomized shape, the gradient going a different direction. I just like the freedom that a tile random gives me over a regular tile generator. I just feel like I have a lot more options to work with. So we've got pattern input here. So for rotation random, this is, again, what I really like about a tile random is now when I go to rotation random, notice that the gradient is changing directions. So now I don't have all of my rocks just popping out in the same direction. How often do you see that in real life? Never is the answer. Okay. It's not Monday, guys. All right. So with a tile random, again, what is really nice is, I already have a gradient set up. And in fact, I'm going to push this normal just a little bit more. Oh, it's already set to 5. We'll keep it at 5 for now. We can push it more later. So what else do I want to do with this? I don't necessarily want to have these random shapes, so I may change those here in just a little bit. Something else that I like to work with is randomizing the symmetry. I'm sorry? I just plugged it into a normal so that way I could see it on the... So this, what we're creating essentially is the height right now. Yes. So let's go. You're fine. I set it to a multiply on the blend node. So you've got your shape in the first slot up here, and you have your gradient in the second slot, and it's on a blend. And you've set your blending mode to multiply? That's not showing up for you?
Like the tile map just looks all white.
Oh, the tile generator. Okay. So the tile generator, by default, is set to the pattern down here is set to square. You need to change it to pattern input.
All right, okay.
I have everything set up just the way it's supposed to be. It's just not sure.
Then is that plugged into Explorer or normal?
Oh, I have this plugged into a normal that is then being put into the normal output. So let's go through the shape. So again, with the shape, what's fun about that is I can, again, do a rotation random. And, I may be tempted to just kind of go crazy with this rotation random, but what I like about this is, again, there's never perfection. So I like to just very, very slightly adjust, and I may need to actually put in a number rather than use a slider, because that's still too high for me. So I'll do something like 0.005 maybe. And so not everything is just perfectly straight at that point. So what's going to be important to you guys, or in my opinion, what's important when creating a tileable texture like this, kind of similar to what you guys did in TPS when you did your hand-painted textures, right? Very rarely do you see things with perfection. You guys are going to be storytellers in this sense, right? Do you want it to be 100% out of, out of the factory, perfect, or do you want to give it some life? Do you want to give it its own background story? Has this wall been here for a while? Whoever laid it, was he, absolutely perfect using levels and everything, laying down these rocks? That's for you to decide, right? Right. So it's that little bit of attention to detail, again, that's going to set you apart from other artists when you're working with this type of software. Well, really when you're working with any type of software, whether it's you're creating a character, an environment, a prop, whatever, you guys are storytellers. You're visual storytellers. All right. Sorry, I get soapboxy. Position. So again, don't be afraid to play around with any of these parameters here until you get something that you like. Now, like I said, position. Again, you can come over here and offset. You can do an offset random. Don't be afraid to play around with these, or just a random in general, which kind of, again, moves things just a little bit. So now we've got that, and I'll leave it at a random state. But what we can also do is position color. There's its size. So if you want all of these rocks to be the same shape and size, you'll come over here and adjust your size X and Y. So by default with a tile random, you've got these, it kind of randomizes those shapes a little bit for you. So again, don't be afraid to play around with these either. So now that we have our large, most basic shapes here, let's just say that this is something that I want to roll with. Let's see. Move that just a little bit. Anyway, you guys can kind of play around with that a little bit further, just to have a decent amount to go over. So now we have our basic perfect shapes of these rocks, right? And some of them are popping in, some of them are popping out. Again, that's just something that is fun. And you can come over here to this levels that we created for the gradients, and you can increase that value if you want, or decrease it. It's up to you. So if you decide that you don't want any of them popping out, you can just bring them back to black and white stage. But for me, again, I like having them with the gradient. If I want them to be less popping out, I just kind of push those gradients closer together. So the next thing that we're going to want to do is add some damage to the edges of these rocks, right? So this is where we come to one of my favorite nodes, which is the slope blur. How many of you guys have used the slope blur at this point? Cool. So with the slope blur, what's really fun about this is I'm going to be able to chip away the edges of this rock using the slope blur noise, or slope blur node, excuse me. So again, we're working in grayscale, so you want to make sure that if you're working in grayscale, you stay with grayscale type nodes. If it doesn't have grayscale at the end, it's an RGB type node. Now you can work with both, but if I work with, let's say, a slope blur without the grayscale, what's going to happen is it's going to add in a gradient here and turn it to an RGB type of nodes there. Now again, I want to stay in grayscale, so I'm going to go to slope blur grayscale, so it won't add in that extra node for me. And I'm going to go ahead and just pop this into the normal. Now with the slope blur, it needs a slope, right? With it, just like the name that it says, it needs a slope to be attached to it. So you can either use a noise. For me, I like to use the Perlin noises for these because they have really good peaks and valleys. They have high and low points. It looks kind of warpy in a way, right? Which one? So this is a Perlin noise 2, but I used a slope blur grayscale. Now I like to also hook up a transform 2D to these nodes because again, I like to either increase the size or decrease the size so that it's tiling more. It's up to you. You're not required to do this. Again, it's just my own workflow. So once I bring this into the slope blur, notice it kind of breaks. Yes. So there's a couple things that we have to do with the slope blur. Always increase your samples to 32. I would bring your intensity down to 0 to start off, and then change the mode from blur to min. And then what we're going to do next is we're going to slowly start increasing that intensity. Now what that does is it starts kind of chipping away the basic shape of those rocks. I would do something kind of like this. So remember, I like to work large detail to small detail. So I'm focusing on the large detail of these rocks at this point in time. So it works kind of like a trim dynamic in a way, like a trim dynamic in ZBrush. You guys think of it, it kind of cuts planes. Does that help at all? No? You guys should know. So what's really cool about slope blurs is they can kind of stack and be blended on each other. So I'm going to continue to do that and just kind of slowly chip away at this. So I'm going to do another slope blur. I'm sorry? This one? This is a Transform 2D. So what this does, again, is I can make it larger, which affects the overall shape, or make it smaller, which, again, affects the overall shape. I'm sorry? Nope, I am not. But it's a good way to start making a stylized roll. But nope, I'm not making stylized. So again, I'm hooking this up to another slope blur, and I'm just going to kind of decrease in size. So I'm going to use a Perlin Noise 1 this time. So again, notice the scale's a little bit smaller. I'm going to plug this in. And again, by default, it looks a little terrifying at first. Just into my normal so you guys can see. Set my samples all the way up to 32, my intensity to 0. Change the mode from blur to min. And now I'm going to just slowly start increasing that intensity. Again, yep. And actually, I'm going to just go straight into the other Perlin Noise Zoom. I'm going to use that instead of this one. I don't really need to take away too much more with those shapes. So here is when we start getting a little bit more of that surface wear and tear. So again, we can either really increase that intensity and have these rocks look really eaten up, or we can just pull back a little bit. And again, I'm going to do one more slope blur grayscale. Maybe, there we go. Feed this in. Bring my samples all the way up, my intensity all the way down. And I'm going to use a Transform 2D, and I'm just going to continue to use this same Perlin Noise Zoom. But what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to decrease the size of this. So I'm going to set it by half so it's smaller. And again, it's going to continue to let me just chip away at those edges. And again, you can go super intense if you want, or, and again, notice it doesn't take a lot for it to have a high intensity. So be mindful of that. So now I've got something, kind of like this. Now I need some surface noise, maybe some pores and things like that. So we will grab just a noise. Let's see. Yeah, kind of like that. We'll do a level so I can control it a bit better. And I'm going to use a blend. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to have this as my background, this as my foreground, and I need to mask out just those rocks, those rock shapes. So there's a couple things that I can do with this. What I like to use is do a histogram scan, perhaps. We may use just the levels with it, but let's just see what we can get with the histogram scan. So I'm going to start increasing the position and get those shapes in here. And then I'm going to, there we go, just push that contrast. So now I've essentially, created a bit of a mask for those shapes. So I really like the histogram scan quite a bit when it comes to creating masks out of things that, you know, generally has a gradient. If you use the levels, sometimes it won't get this clean. Don't worry, I'll sit with you afterwards. You get this really nice clean edging. And if it's too harsh, you can always run it through a blur, a high quality blur, and bring your quality all the way up and then just barely have some intensity on that so it feels just a little bit more softened. Now what this is going to do is it's going to mask out so that it's only affecting the surface of these rocks. Now that is probably a little much, and I'm losing the detail here. So I'm going to do a, I don't really care for a multiply. No. We'll do an overlay. They're all Perlin noises. Can you be more specific? So one is a Perlin noise 2. One is a Perlin noise zoom. Yep. I'm losing just a little bit of that depth. It's just a noise generator with a levels, so that way I can push and pull some of that damage. Yeah, so I actually want this to be a little bit lighter because I don't want it to be quite so intense. In fact, let me change this from overlay. I still don't really care for multiply. Something that you might also see is a bit of haloing. So what this means is I need to come back and adjust my histogram. There we go. So I've got my shapes in here. And you may find also that you want to come in and reblend some of this back on. But I think we still have a lot of that detail here. So let's just test it out and see what we get. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to make my own normal for this noise and overlay it and keep this as my main normal. Let's go ahead and get rid of this. And I'll still use a blend. So I'll have this up top and I will mask out those rocks and then I'll create my own normal for this. And so with that, I can adjust my intensity here because I don't want it to take away from all the detail that I've created here. So what I can do with this is create a normal. Have it at, I don't know, let's do like a 12 intensity. And then I can do a normal combine. Have this as my base normal. And have this as the normal where I'm overlaying those pits. And so now what I have, let me get rid of, I'm just going to feed it directly into this because the PBR base material doesn't like being fed a normal combine. So I'm just going to override this and go straight into my output. So what's really nice about this workflow is if I want a more intense like pitted area, I have the control to just affect those rocks alone without it affecting my overall depth. Does that make sense? Yes. Yes. You're talking about exposing the parameter? Yes. So the way to do that, this is something I typically wait to go over until next week, but since you're asking those questions, I'm going to go ahead and show you now. So exposing the parameters, something that, again, is not usually something I go over week 3, but it's an important thing to know. This is what makes, in my opinion, Substance Designer so awesome. You guys have probably opened up materials in the past and seen all these sliders that you can adjust, or even when you get into Substance Painter, you have all of those parameters that you can mess around with. This is where that starts. So what I'm going to do, like he said, to adjust maybe that normal slider, I am going to come here and hit expose. And I'm going to always give it its own name because if I'm wanting to expose the intensity for the other normal, if I just have intensity on both of them, they will overwrite each other. So I'm going to say maybe rock pour intensity. I can spell. Okay, and okay. And then notice I can no longer edit that intensity. I'm going to do the same for this normal shape as well, or the large shape. So I'm going to expose and give it a new name. Give it a new name. Okay. Why is it being finicky? Let's go ahead and save this. Let's just do that. And we'll do, let's try this again. There we go. Okay. So we'll name this large rock, maybe intensity again. Hit OK. So again, notice that I can no longer edit the intensity of this. So where that's going to be located is if I just select my rock graph and come down here, there's some input parameters that exist. Now there's a few things that you're going to want to edit when doing this. So if we come over here and drop this down, you're going to probably want to name this something differently. So the label, we'll just say pore intensity instead, because I like to group these. So we'll just say large rocks. So it's going to be a group of large rocks. And now again, this is something that I will go over again with you guys next week. And that should be it. So we'll have pore intensity. It's grouped into large rocks. And I'm going to do the same with my large rock intensity. So the label large rock intensity group. Group is rock, I think, is what I put on here. Large rocks. Okay. So large rocks. Now, this doesn't look very fun to kind of mess around with. So if you're wanting to get an easier slider, you want to hit this little folder here. So switch to preview mode. And so now we've got that pore intensity that we're increasing and that large rock intensity that we're increasing and decreasing. Does that make sense? Awesome. All right, so going back, we'll just come back to this if we need to adjust that intensity. So I have kind of a base rock shape. Now notice the grout, super clean, right? We don't really want that, right? It needs to have some sort of grout detail to it. So we're going to go ahead and mask that in, or bring that into our material. So let me just pull this back a little bit. And I don't need this anymore. So first things first is I want to just grab a noise of some sort. And I probably will use just what I already created. I already kind of like the normal on this. So we will come in here and grab another normal. Actually, I'm going to grab a levels first. And I'm just going to reuse this noise, give it another levels. So again, I have a little bit of control over that. And I'm going to blend it. And just like how I blended it here, I actually want the inverse of this. So I'm going to use an invert grayscale for this. So invert grayscale, because I want to mask out those rocks. I don't want to affect the rocks. I only want these grout lines affected. Now again, I may need to create another histogram range because you'll see there might be a little bit of haloing that we need to make adjustments to. So I'm just going to pop this into here. And so now it's just affecting those grout areas. So with that being said, I can grab a normal and again adjust the intensity for those and do another normal combine. So I've got this here. Yes? This is a normal combine. And I actually don't like using the same noise that I have on here, so I'm going to swap that out. And we'll do something like clouds, because it's a little bit more billowy, and I may add in some extra noise on top of that, but we'll put the levels here. So now, yeah, I'm going to blend another noise. Do black and white spots 3. So there's 2 here, there's 3 here. So I'm going to blend these together. And I want this to be on top and this to be on bottom. And do multiply. So now I have those high shapes, those large shapes in here, and then also those really fine shapes added in. So that's what we're going to use. So now we've got this mixed in. As it should be. And when we hook this up, so now we have kind of this breakup. And again, you guys will get the recording of this later, so you'll be able to follow along if you'd like. And again, there's no one way to make these rock shapes. Again, what I'm showing you guys is kind of my own workflow, okay? So you're not required to do it this way. If you find a better way that works for you, cool. So one other thing, I'm going to go ahead and finish up doing the base color and the roughness for this, and then we're going to move on to some other tips and tricks, okay? So this is going to be the only material that I kind of do a start to finish. The rest are going to be more conceptual, okay? Okay. So let's go ahead and get into the roughness of this, because that's one of the things that I like to start off doing. Yes, that is something that I mentioned earlier. The normal combine does not like to be fed into a base material, so that's why I overwrote it right here.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yes, so normal maps will only take a grayscale image. So if you input a normal map that's already been created into another normal map, it's going to convert it into a grayscale. Yep. So that's why we create the height map first. All right, so what I'm going to do for my roughness is do an invert grayscale, because if we look at this, so what I did was I fed this through a normal to height and a levels. Actually, that's not what I want. I want to grab a curvature smooth, and I want to feed this in. And this is what I'm going to use to start making my roughness. Now, what I want you guys to take note of is notice on like these high points of this shape here, they're really light, right? And if I'm using this as a roughness, I kind of want it to be the opposite of that, right? The inverse of that. I want these nice high points that have been chipped away to kind of catch the light a little bit more, right? So that's going to have less roughness and a more smooth area compared to these. So what I'm going to do, and I really like using the curvature smooth to generate my roughness, or at least as a starting point, because it gets those high points really well. So I'm going to use another invert grayscale, and probably a levels, because again, I don't necessarily want it to be that dark. And we'll just bring this up so it's not 100% black. And I'll pop this into the roughness just to start off with, and I'll continue to make my adjustments as I go. So now notice that all of those high points in here, and let me do one last thing. Let me feed this into our height. Something that's kind of fun about Designer is being able to get a little bit of parallaxing happening. So I'm going to come over here to Materials, go to Edit, and I'm just going to scale this up a little bit. Now, if you have a really good height map, which hopefully you do because you've generated one for your normal, right? And what I did at the end of this is I just did a normal to height, and then a levels to go after that, and I plugged it into the height. Now, to make the parallaxing work, you have to have a height map hooked up, okay? Now, if you guys are using any tutorials and you notice that the geometry itself, when you're following it, warps, like it changes the geometry, I am sorry to say, if you are on a Mac computer, this will not work for you, okay? You will not have a parallax tessellation. It is only available on Windows. But what you do have, is you do have a parallax occlusion, which gives the illusion that there's tessellation happening. So if you come over here to Materials Edit and you just start playing around with that scale, you can kind of get an idea on what your parallax is doing and how well your height map is actually working. So I don't know how well you guys can see that, but it is, you know, kind of giving that distortion. So I like to work this way mostly because it's just fun and it looks really nice for beauty shots. Now if I go too intense of this, it starts to get really ugly in some areas, right? Sorry, that doesn't look too bad, but if I were to zoom in or like look at the top, it looks a little funky, right? So, you know, use this with moderation. 0.5 is usually as high as I go, typically, for the depth. And again, something else that's affected is coming in and messing around with that normal intensity. All right, so I was adjusting that roughness. So what's really fun about the roughness that I worked with is all of those darker areas, the light that's being caught are those chipped away areas, those probably very smooth areas. Now it's a little bit shinier than what I probably would want it to be. So I'm going to come in and just push this a little bit more. So it's still catching the light, but it's not quite as intense as it was. So does that make sense on why I used an invert grayscale and I used a curvature smooth to generate my roughness map? Yes? Is there anything that's not clear on as to why I did it that way? It's totally fine if it's not. Okay. So now that I've got my, you know, basic roughness, my normal, I'm going to go ahead and want to create my base color for this. So again, we have all these masks that we've generated, and I'm just going to start with my rock surface. So I'm going to use the Googles to find just a brick material or bricks image. Now you guys aren't required to use a bricks image. I just think it gives me an overall nice color variation. I don't really care for that one. Oh, I do like that one. All right. Minimize this. And I can already tell you that some of these values are too dark, but I'm going to import this in. And since I'm not going to have it be a part of my my overall material, I'm just going to link the resources. Now, if you guys are creating masks in Photoshop, you're going to want to physically import those those bitmaps instead, okay? So I have this lovely image here, and I'm just going to use this for a gradient map to work with. Now again, I have a lot of noises already created, so I'm just going to use those with my gradient map. So we will start off with the surface of the bricks, which we decided was this. So I'm going to grab this and I'm going to use this. And I'm just going to color sample. And again, I do know that there are some values in here that are way too dark, and I'll make adjustments to that later. But I'm going to go to that gradient editor, which pops up this window, pick gradient, and I'm just going to kind of slide it. So I have all of these really cool values to work with. So now if we look at that gradient, and again, some of that may be too dark. We'll play around with it and see. So here's going to be my base color for all of my bricks, and then I'll go in and I'll make a grout to follow up with that. So I'm going to grab a blend. I'm going to say here is our foreground, and I'm going to mask out the grout, which we've already done here. So basically what I'm trying to teach you guys is how to reuse the resources that you've already created rather than generate a whole new mask. And I'm going to pop this into here. So now here's my brick colors. And then now I just want to find something that, and I'm probably going to use this again because I really like the color variation, but I'll do like a hue saturation adjustment with this. And so we've decided that this was what our grout kind of looked like. So I'll grab another gradient. Feed that in. Put this here, invisible. Create editor. And I'll probably just stay in this range here. So that gives me a little bit, whoa, that is crazy. All right, so I'm going to put a hue saturation levels on this, and I'll show you why I'm doing that here. Not levels, hue saturation lightness. And I'm going to just feed this in with this. So notice it's way too close to the original image. And because we already have it masked out, it knows to go into that grout section. So the first thing I'm going to do is just kind of dramatically change the color to something a little bit cooler. Let's do something like that. And I'm going to just desaturate this by quite a bit and maybe lighten it a bit more. And now when I feed this into my color, this is kind of closer to what we get. Now, the noise that I generated, some of that detail in here for the grout, I'm not really a huge fan of. So that's because of the clouds that we have here. So what I'm probably going to do instead is just grab this one and feed that in instead. And the shapes are still a little too large. So it's not always perfect, you know, on your first try. And something else that I'm noticing is I kind of want to get that normal intensity a bit more. It just feels a little too muted. So I'm going to grab a hue saturation, and I'm going to just saturate this just a little bit more because I want those bricks to pop. I'm going to darken them just a bit. And maybe you don't like any of those colors. Maybe you want it to be a bit more red. That's kind of what's fun about the hue saturation. And honestly, that popping out is way too much for my liking. There we go. So we'll do something closer to that. So there's kind of like a quick and dirty, I would play around with this probably for another hour before being like, I'm done with this material. But that is a quick and dirty workflow that I kind of want you guys to follow. You know, make your height and normals first. That way you can see where your large and small detail is. Then go in, make your roughness, and then finally mess around with your base color. And after you get your base color, you might see, oh, I want to push this grout a little bit more. Oh, I want my roughness to, you know, be less shiny. After you do all of those pieces, then you can go back in and start tweaking, okay? So that's going to be like the only material that I kind of do a start to finish. Again, I would mess around with this for a lot longer. I'm not really, Anyway, so we will jump on to the next topic. And that's going to be shapes. So first things first, you guys are going to be required to make some sort of ornate design tile. And hopefully you guys all looked at the reference images and kind of saw the direction that I'm wanting you to go in. I've also attached a tutorial PDF that I found on Gumroad that was for free. Have you guys been to Gumroad before? I love Gumroad. Okay, so Gumroad is great for, they have tutorials that are on there. Most of them are, not most of them, a lot of them are industry professionals that, again, kind of want to get paid for teaching how they work. And something you guys may have noticed when you get on things like YouTube or just Google trying to find tutorials, you're kind of limited on what tutorials you find on Designer, right? It's okay if you haven't looked at all. And that, a lot of that is because, again, a lot of industry professionals do use Designer, but they don't all want to take the time to show you how they use it, right? Allegorithmic is really, really great about pushing out tutorials, and they work with us instructors as well and do monthly webinars to teach us new tips and tricks so that way we can show you guys, which is really awesome. So it is, and the other reason why you don't find a whole lot of tutorials is just like last time when we did the stucco exercise. All of your guys' stucco looked completely different, right? It's because there's just no one set way to necessarily do something. So we're going to move on to shapes. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys one of the tiles that I created. I looked at my floor in my house and I decided I wanted to recreate the tile that is in my house. So, and there's an important lesson in regards to this. Let's see. Yes. So there's a few things that I want to impart on you guys with this. The first thing that I want you to know is you do not have to use this workflow at all. And the reason why is because I decided, and again, I made this at like 2 in the morning. I was sleep deprived, and I was just like, you know what? I want to make my floor in my house. And this is exactly what it looks like. It's not made out of wood. It is actually like porcelain tile, or I don't really know what material it is. It is a, no, it is not laminated. It is like a full-on tile. But it's not wood. It's just designed to look like a wood patterned tile. Now I haven't paid any attention to roughness, nothing. Did you have a question?
Yeah.
Yes.
Roughly how many hours?
I probably spent it's been a few months since I've worked on this. I mean, I know it was like more than 2 hours. So how long should it take you? That depends on what workflow you go with. So really, for any of you guys, I recommend spending a minimum of 2 to 4 hours per material, depending on the complexity of it. Spending at least 2 hours on a material that you're creating, it makes sure that you're really thorough. Even if it's something very simple like stucco. I know we only spent 15 minutes on it, but you really can't see that attention to detail unless you're actually like in there and giving it a little bit more purpose. If you're spending 30 minutes on a material, and again, it depends on what it's for, right? If you need something really quick, spend 30 minutes on a material. It's really up to you, but for me, my recommendation is a minimum of 2 hours, and I've seen some materials take 12 hours at times. It just depends on what it is, why you're doing it, and how fast you need that turnaround. Obviously, you guys don't have the time to spend 12 hours on every single material. You guys have 6 to do. I know I'm not asking a small thing here, right? But what I do want to say is I decided I did not want to lead Designer. I wanted to do everything in Designer. And so I started with very basic shapes, and I would blend them, and I would use what's called the add and subtract method. And so what that means, and I'll just kind of do a quick and dirty one here, so I'll just grab a shape. And usually you start off with a square depending on what it is. You hook it up to a Transform 2D, and then you kind of scale it down. So I'm holding Command and Shift so I can scale it universally. And if you notice that there's no edges, what you'll need to do is turn off your tiling with your Transform 2D. So now I have that nice little frame. And then let's say I want to take a circle out of this. So I'll do another shape, and we'll make it a disc. And Transform 2D. And actually, I'm just going to leave it like this so where you guys can kind of see the effects of it, and grab a blend. And I want to subtract these circles from this square. And actually, let me turn off transform, or tiling. So no tiling. So we just have this disc. Yes?
I grabbed the reference from Google, and I just cleaned it up on Photoshop.
I will get to that. Yes, I will definitely get to that. So I want to subtract this circle from the square. So this is the most basic add and subtract method. So I'm going to go to this blend mode, and I'm going to set it to subtract. So now I have a square with a circle cut out of it, right? So that's going to be kind of, if you're wanting to stay completely in Designer, that's going to be your workflow. And it's going to look like Stairway to Heaven probably in some areas, because you're just going to do blend on blend on blend on blend. Notice how I have, again, just kind of this cascading happening. Now, something that I said last time is I don't care how large or small your graph is. And I use this as an example every time. Like I said, I did this at like 2 in the morning. Notice some of the masks that I ended up with here after doing all of this. I spent a long time working on these shapes. I had never done this workflow before, ever. And why I decided to do it at 2 in the morning, you think of crazy things to do when you're sleep deprived, right? So I had this mentality that I wanted to do this floor and do every single shape inside of Designer, which was awesome. I'm so glad that I did it, because I learned a lot more about the software. But when I got more sleep, guess what? I remembered. I remembered this shape. And do you know what this shape does?
Oh, I want to save you hours.
So can you imagine how I felt when I woke up in the morning and remembered about this node, and I went back and looked at some of the masks that I created, and yeah. So my point is, think about how much space and graph time that would have saved me. So my point in saying this is, I do not care how large or small your graph is. My graph probably would have been significantly, when I first opened this, you guys were like, oh, what? Think about how much smaller my graph probably would have been if I had just remembered that one node. Right. It would have been a lot less. But you know what? I still would have ended up with the same result. That's the other thing that I want to emphasize. Just because this graph exists does not mean that this method is wrong either. It just means that I went about it a different way. Okay? Yes, words of encouragement. I do have them. So with that also being said, you guys do not have to create all of your masks inside of Designer. This is the only time I'm going to let you go inside of Photoshop. Now what I do expect, if you are in Photoshop creating these masks, if it is something that is required to be a different color, it needs to be a separate mask. So let's say that I have, let me do another Transform 2D here, and I'm just going to make this a little bit smaller, and I'm going to move it here, and actually that a little bit smaller. And so I'm just going to throw something together really quickly. So I've got this here, and I want to add in this circle, so I'm going to do an add. And I'm going to add or take away this circle. I might move that. I'm going to set this to subtract, but I want set this to subtract. I did. Should be. I don't know why it's not working. 1 second. Sorry, my blend is being finicky. So I have this shape. Turn off tiling. And I'm going to make this just a little bit smaller so that way I've cut out essentially a ring from this. Oh, I see what I did wrong. I've got these feeding into each other. So let me try this again. So what was happening is this is why parenting and order of operations really matters. All right, so I'm going to make this half and half. So this is my base shape that I want to start off with. I'm going to do a Transform 2D here and another Transform 2D here. So I have these two shapes. They are now independent of one another. I was making them dependent on the other. So I'm going to do my blend. And I want to subtract this shape from this shape. Right now they're the same size. So I have this set to subtract. So we don't see anything. It's subtracting from itself. So if I make this one smaller, I'm holding Command and Shift. Now I've got a nice ring. Use Transform 2D again. And I'm just going to move this up here. So I'm going to blend these two together. So this is the background. This is the foreground. And oops, add. Right, I'll need to invert this. And mask out. right, because we have the square as our base shape. So I'll have to rework from the beginning. So we need this background to be black in order for us to have that shape. So I'm actually going to invert this so that this area is now masked out. And now when I blend these together, this is my background, this is my foreground, and whenever I go to add them, now they show up together. Now if you ever want this black area to be framed out again, we have it masked out here and you can use that to blend later. In fact, no, we'll leave it as is for now. So essentially I have, you know, 3 different masks going on here, right? And I want each of these to be a different color. So the way that we do that, again, you guys have already done the hard work in creating the masks. And I'm just going to grab some random colors here to use as examples. So we'll use like purple. And so I'm going to create a blend. This is my foreground. And I want to actually do the inverse of this and mask out everything and make my frame purple. So I'm going to pop this into here so that only my frame is affected. So there's one color. So this is one mask that you would create in Photoshop. So anything that you want to have a different color or a different detail needs to be its own individual mask. So while you may be tempted to create something like this by itself in Photoshop, you need to do it in layers so that way you can export them out one at a time. And the reason why is so you can have the control like this. Otherwise, you're going to have to go back into Photoshop, add in color. And my point is to try to keep you in Designer as much as possible. I used to not even let the students leave Designer. They had to make everything in Designer. And so I would end up with not so great ornate tiles because of, you know, again, a lack of exposure to it and really not understanding the workflow. And again, my purpose is not to force a workflow onto you guys. It's just to share my workflows with you. So if it's faster for you to make some ornate designs in Photoshop, as long as they are black and white masks and you import them in. So for example, let me just boot up Photoshop real quick. How are we on time? We're okay on time. So I'm going to make some lovely ornate designs with my mouse. So we'll just do File, New, and a 512 should be fine. And so I'm going to make a new layer. Put a brush. Right. So let's say that that's one design. There's another. There's another. I know it's gorgeous, right? So what I'm going to want you to do is export these one at a time, or save them out one at a time. So save as, desktop, say I1. And you can do JPEG, you can do a PNG, just do a JPEG, I'll put it on my desktop. And, oh, here we go. Okay. And do this for each one. So it is a little, repetitive. And it does take a little bit more time. So, 2. But again, if working in Designer to make these shapes is difficult for you and it's taking you a lot longer than what you're happy with, or you're not able to get the ornate detail that you were wanting, it's okay to come into Photoshop since it is a software that you guys have access to. It is a software that you can use for this. It makes total sense to do it this way. Now, some things that I do want to emphasize, when you're bringing in bitmaps, you can come over here, right-click, do an import bitmap. So if you're bringing in something that you want to stay in your project, you need to do an import, okay? Otherwise, if you do link, like if you drag and drop and select link instead of import, it's linking the physical location of that bitmap. So if you have it on your desktop, it's knowing to check the desktop and bring in that bitmap. Now what happens when you try to send that over to me and I'm trying to find that bitmap that's located on your desktop? It's not going to work, right? So let's see, we did I1, I2, and smile. So I'm going to hit open. And so what that does is it creates a resource folder. So what I want you guys to make sure that happens is that your bitmaps are in that resource folder. So I'm going to grab the I, place that in, I2. Now one thing to note is I'm probably going to have to invert these. If you want to work in inverse in Photoshop, that's totally fine. It's up to you. So now I can start doing an invert grayscale. And by default, they do come in you may have to swap them to grayscale mode. Otherwise, you're going to get that convert to grayscale. So I'm going to switch these to grayscale. You can also have Photoshop set your images to grayscale. And the way to do that, in case you guys don't know, is go to Image, Mode, and set it to grayscale. So that will bring in the bitmap to grayscale instead of an RGB color. Okay? So if you want to save yourself a step, that's another workflow that you can do. So now I'm going to do another invert grayscale. And again, if I want to do a different color for each one of these, it makes my life so much easier to go this route. So there's one. I'm finding really hideous colors today. Isn't it? Let's make something a little bit softer. Oops. I have to reconnect that. And when I'm ready, I can now blend these two together and then do the same. I know my graph is all over the place right now. So now I have all of those colors added in. I sure did. I am an artist. Sorry. So does that make sense as to why I want them to be separate? You had a question?
Yeah, can you export RGB?
You can. I just don't want you to. Yeah, I want you to do all of your color information in here. You can make your black and white masks in Photoshop, but I want you adding in the color, because very rarely are you going to have just a solid color. You're going to have some sort of noise added to it, things like that. So I want you to do any color or roughness. The only thing that I want you guys doing in Photoshop is your masks. All right? Cool. Do you guys have any other questions on this whole shape process? I can go over it a little bit more if you'd like. Okay. So we went over blending shapes. Now, wood grain. So that's a fun one to work with. Wood grain is so easy, and it looks way more difficult than what it is. If you notice on this tile here, I've got, you know, kind of this wood grain sort of detail happening, and wood is something you guys are required to do. Now, some of you may decide to do bark instead of wood grain. It's totally fine. But this section right here, this is what I found the most fun and easy way to do wood grain. So we do already have these pre-existing wood fibers. Now, again, I've seen in the past where they're like, all right, here's my wood. I created a wood material. No. You've got these starting points. I do not want to see these be your start and finish wood grain. They're wood fibers. It's not wood grain. It's not the same thing, right? So in order to get sort of these awesome warpy shapes, there's a few things that we need to do. Now, again, you don't have to work with wood fibers. You can work really with any noise so long as it's going a specific direction. So let's see if we can get just a noise to do what we want it to do. Let's see. Let's do maybe a directional warp. And we need some sort of warp to go with this, so let's transform 2D instead. Actually, no, we're not. You guys can play around with that. We're going to continue to work with just the wood fibers. So first things first, decide what direction you want your wood grain to go. If it's vertical, leave it like this. If it's not, add in a transform 2D and rotate it. So now it's going the direction that you may want it to go. Now, in order for this to work, we actually need to blur this quite a bit. So I like to do a blur high quality grayscale. It's a little, you want the quality to be all the way up. So my point in this is, again, to get a blend of values, not contrasting values. I want them to just, again, blur and kind of melt together. And so I kind of do this a few times. I've got up here, again, a high quality, a directional blur, which is really useful. So I'm going to blur this actually just a little bit more. And then add in a directional blur. And again, we're just pushing that intensity just a little bit. So again, some swirly values kind of happening in there. Does that make sense? I know so far you guys can't see the light at the end of the tunnel, but I promise this is the fun part. You may even want to do some levels in here. I'm kind of okay with the different values that I have, but I almost always stick a levels on with this so I can adjust that intensity. Now, this is my favorite part. So we will need a gradient dynamic. Now what the gradient dynamic needs is a gradient input. So we're going to grab a gradient linear. Now we're not seeing anything happen, and that's because we need to change the gradient orientation. So we need to change this to be the opposite of what you want your grain to be going. If I just left this as is, horizontal would have been fine, but we have it going horizontal, so we want our gradient orientation to go vertical. So now at this point, this is where things get fun. I'm going to double click here and then single click here. Now as I start adjusting the tiling, that's when we start getting some of that gradient happening, or that grain happening. Now it's capped out at 6. No, it's not. We can start adding in more values and again continue to push that. So this is how I like to create wood grain. It's also really good if you're trying to create things like oil, because again, if you guys ever looked at oil, how it's kind of got those rainbowy, swirly colors, kind of like this. It's a really fun way to create wood grain. And then you can go back through and start layering on those wood fibers back in. So you've got your grain here. If we do a blend, and again, I do like to have the levels. So grab this guy, have this as my base, and actually I'm going to add a levels to this too, because we just have stark, black and white in some of these areas, and again, I don't really like that. So I like to have kind of some values in between. So we'll have this as our base, and we can set this to multiply. And we can even adjust the intensity on how much that's showing. So now we've got kind of some wood fibers in with our wood grain. Does that make sense? So that's how I recommend you guys make your wood grain. There's certainly, again, multiple ways you can do this. This is just the workflow that, again, I learned, and I kind of have fun when it comes to using that gradient dynamic and just start pushing that tiling amount. It's kind of a fun moment. Yes?
What's that, that always
Directional blur. Yep.
What's the one to the left of that?
The left of that is a blur high quality grayscale. All right. So that's kind of my tips and tricks on some of the few things that you guys will be working on. I know you have like a dirt material that you're going to be creating. So the workflow that I recommend that you do with that is create your base dirt first. Go in and then make your rock shapes. Now, you guys already learned how to make rock shapes when we use that tile generator. You don't have to use that same method. What you can do well, it's kind of a similar method. Instead of using bricks, you can come in here and use a disc and kind of adjust that shape. You can use, from there, you can either grab like a bevel and kind of give yourself some fall off, and then go in and use your slope blur. What is happening here? No, I don't want that. Standard. And Curlin noise 1, and we can start pulling away. You can either use just blur on this, so don't be afraid to mess around with the different modes. Depending on what you're going for, you may want, you know, some different intensities and whatnot. So there's a nice quick and dirty stone for you that you can add in. And again, I still recommend doing some sort of gradient to add in so you can push and play around with that depth, just like what we did with the bricks. It's the same process, it's just a different shape, okay? And so you can scatter them around, mask them out, and add them into that dirt that you're creating, okay? So with the ornate tiles, again, you don't have to go this workflow if you don't want to. You can create those shapes, and we didn't do that, I had deleted it out of Photoshop and then bring them in. It's just very important that you make sure that they're in with your resources folder. And when you're ready to export, and I do have instructions on FSO for this, but when you're ready to export, you want to do an export with dependencies. This is going to make sure that all of your extra things that you may have in Designer is going to transfer over whenever I open it, okay? So you want to make sure that you have that, especially if you find like a generator on Substance Share or something like that that makes your life a little bit easier. If you do not have this, I will not be able to open it properly, okay? It's going to show red nodes everywhere. Some of your nodes are going to be empty, and I'm going to be like, your beauty shot looks great, but when I open your graph, something happened, right? So that's something, again, that I want you guys to make sure that you are practicing for your workflow. Let's see, what else? So the ornate designs, you guys have the 2 that you can choose. So any that you want, as long as it's not stucco. I also recommend not doing bricks. You guys are going to get to do bricks in LVL. Okay, so if you've already started bricks, that's okay, that's fine. I'm not going to penalize you for creating bricks. But you're already making cobblestone, which in its way is its own pattern rock. So I recommend trying something a little bit different, okay? And again, those of you that are character artists, make something that makes sense to a character that you want to create that you may not be able to find all the time. That may just kind of keep your interest in the software, okay? I'm sorry? There's usually a skins shader, so I don't recommend doing skin. There's a lot of layering in that, and usually the engine also has some material stuff that you have to do. So I don't recommend doing skin, all right? Okay, do you guys have any questions? Yes? So to make a simple cloth, really it depends on, so if we come over here, let me open my library back up. So by default, we have a lot of patterns that pre-exist in here. Let me see. So if we come in here to generators, we've got some pre-existing patterns, and you probably would have an easy time making some of those shapes. You just have to kind of get your blending and your masking working correctly, and just make sure that it is scaled up enough to where it is seen as fine and not necessarily, you know, large scale like this. I do know that it does have a cloth as a base material in here. Where are you? PBR materials. So if we come in here and do fabric, so it's got, there are some, you know, different fabric patterns that do exist, and what you can do with this knowledge is you can't use the fabric in here, but what you can do is you can right click and you can do, where is it? Open reference and say open. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow you to look at how this was made. You can't edit it, but it will go into, again, some of those workflows. All right. You're welcome. Are there any other questions? It's actually not that bad. It is not organized, that is correct. Yes. So, also something else to note with these fabrics, sometimes there are graphs within graphs. So again, we'll have to open reference. And here's the most basic. Oh yes. Like I said, there's a lot that goes into Designer. A lot. I was not kidding. So use your lecture slides. I will upload the lecture so you guys have them. Use video tutorials if you're still unsure on how to do something. Use Substance Share. People upload their images or their substances all the time. They use those so you guys can use them to learn. Use the default materials that already exist in here. Break them down. You know, understand why, you know, with this fabric, why did they start off with this random pre-existing node? Oh, I can actually see how this herb one was created. Okay, it's actually too crazy if you break it down. So a lot of times Substance Designer looks way more complicated than it is, but it's actually made up of much simpler graphs being brought in, and they're just layered on top of one another. So there's and what's nice about this is this one graph, again, maybe this pattern, as an artist you may decide, hey, I may want this for something else. Now you have another substance that you've created that you can use multiple times. So it's really adding a lot of diversity to your materials because you have created all these simple patterns that you can use later on. So for example, this might be some crazy grass, even though it scratches. And if we look in here and do an open reference, we can see it was actually an effects maps, which is kind of terrifying for me. But again, you can come in here and edit effects maps and see exactly how, this is why I don't like effects maps. I'm like, what? Yeah. So, like I said, effects maps are one of those things that I have not let myself get too into. I've been able to accomplish any material that I've needed to create without using effects maps. I know the day is going to come when it allows you to use math as a way of generating your own. It lets you create your own generator.
I heard the M word.
Yes. So I know the day is going to come when I need to go in and actually learn effects maps. The day's not arrived yet, but it will.
Why is it its own thing that it's being a part of the aspect?
So you can mess with it again, but it uses numbers instead of images. Whereas with, you know, this process, it's using images to create the textures.
What is it based off?
Yes.
How a graph works?
Yes. So these are quadrants. So it bases it off of quadrants. And again, if it's something that you're comfortable with, have fun with it. Like, try it out. I do it. No, I encourage you to try it out. If it's something that interests you, do try it out. It opens up, again, once you're comfortable with Designer and you want to jump into effects maps, do it. Because it opens up a whole nother world of different types of how you can push your materials. Like, it really does. Like I said, for me, I've not been in a situation where I've had to go in and learn effects maps, but there will be a day, it is coming, where I'm going to have to learn, suck it up and learn effects maps. So, do you guys have any other questions for me? Is there any other practices or anything that you're unsure about so far? I know I just kind of dumped a whole load of information onto you guys. That's okay. I know I talk really fast. So like I said, I will be uploading this lecture for you guys so you have it to reference. Use tutorials, use Substance Share, use the pre-existing materials on here. Reverse engineer this stuff. That's really how you're going to understand the why of things, is kind of reverse engineering and understanding why one node was used over another. If you find the results being better using a different node, use the different node. Find your own workflow. I encourage you guys to do that. Or use other people's workflows until you find your own workflow, okay? There's nothing wrong with that either. And if some of you are like, designer's not for me, use tutorials the whole time. That's totally fine. Like I said, I'm totally okay with you doing that. Yeah, I'm done soapboxing. So that being said, Friday we will be doing critiques. Please make sure that you are uploading them to FSO. I will be downloading them. We will be doing them on the projector. And again, it's not to single anybody out. It's not to point out everything that's wrong with your material. It's so that way you can see the workflow being done, or the way to make adjustments. And maybe, you know, your neighbor needs the same help, right? Like I said, I don't expect any of you guys to be good at this software yet. If you are, awesome. Yes.
So we just upload what we have done.
Yes. Yeah. Hopefully you have at least 1 or 2 materials done by then. And if you're to a point where you're like, this is just not making sense for me, that's fine. We can sit together and work through it together. Okay? All right. You guys have a great day.